The private hospital in Savannah was hushed, its hallways polished to a sterile gleam. The faint tang of disinfectant lingered in the air, sharp and clinical, but in room 412 the smell was softened by something unexpected. Fresh white roses, their delicate fragrance rising from a tall crystal vase on the bedside table. They had been placed there by Charles Whitaker, a man who, to anyone watching, looked like a devoted husband keeping vigil over his ailing wife. On the bed lay Eleanor Whitaker, only 25 years old, her face pale and unnaturally still. A brain tumor had thrust her into a coma just hours earlier, leaving her life entirely in the hands of doctors at this prestigious private clinic. Machines hummed steadily around her, each beep and flicker of light marking the fragile rhythm of her existence. Charles, who had turned 29 the very morning, sat at her side with his head bowed, his expression composed into a mask of grief. He squeezed Eleanor's fingers gently, as if he were clinging to hope. But when his eyes flicked to the door, making sure no nurse or doctor was near, his posture shifted. He leaned close, his lips almost brushing his wife's ear, and whispered words that sliced through the stillness like glass. "This is the best birthday gift you could ever give me," he said softly, almost gleefully. "I couldn't have dreamed of anything better." For a moment, silence hung in the room, broken only by the steady hiss of oxygen and the slow beep of the monitor. Then the door opened with a quiet creak, and Charles instantly rearranged his face, shoulders shaking as he buried his face in the sleeve of the hospital gown he had borrowed. He pressed out a sob that looked convincing enough. "Eleanor, my sweet girl, why you?" His voice cracked, but the tears wetting his lashes were not born of sorrow. They had been rubbed there a second earlier with the stiff edge of a linen napkin. A firm but gentle hand touched his shoulder. "Mr. Whitaker," came the voice of Dr. Harold Jennings, the chief neurosurgeon. "I'm sorry to intrude, but I need your signature on a few documents concerning your wife's treatment and stay." Charles turned, eyes glistening, the picture of a grieving husband. "Doctor," he began, voice heavy with feigned despair, "please tell me the truth. How is she? Truly?" Jennings hesitated, his professional calm briefly faltering. "Your wife is in a stable but critical state," he admitted. "We've done everything possible to relieve the swelling and preserve her functions. But as for recovery," he spread his hands, "it would be premature to speak of timelines. Weeks, perhaps months, before we know more. Sometimes even years." Charles lowered his gaze, wiping at phantom tears. "But you're telling me she won't wake up soon. Isn't that right?" He leaned forward, voice low, persuasive. "You see, doctor, I must prepare. If the worst should happen, I need to handle business matters, legal papers, financial transitions. These things take time." Jennings frowned, shifting uncomfortably. "Mr. Whitaker, it is far too early for that. We can't predict outcomes so narrowly. Medicine has its limits, yes, but we do not abandon hope. Your wife is young. There is always a chance." Charles's eyes darkened, though he kept his tone measured. He studied the doctor carefully, searching for a crack. Rumors had reached him. Jennings's fondness for whiskey after hours, his debts from card games with other physicians. Weaknesses, exploitable. "So what you're saying," Charles murmured slowly, "is that her chances of returning to full capacity in the next year or two are essentially zero." The doctor faltered, his lips pressing thin, a sheen of sweat gathering at his temple. "Not zero," he said reluctantly, "but very small." Charles let a thin smile creep onto his lips. He leaned back, his demeanor shifting from sorrow to calculation. "Doctor, let me be plain. What if I asked you to help ensure she remained as she is for a while longer? Not forever, just long enough for me to settle affairs. And then, when the time is right, withdraw the machines." Jennings's eyes widened, horror flashing across his features. "Mr. Whitaker, that would be unethical." "I swore an oath. Hippocratic oath." Charles cut him off with a smirk. Please, I'm not asking you to kill her. Merely to ease up. Less aggressive treatment. Lower doses. Let nature take its course. That's all. The surgeon's throat bobbed as he swallowed. You're asking me to neglect my duty. I'm offering you a choice, Charles replied smoothly. He pulled his phone from his pocket, tapping the screen until a number appeared in bold digits. 5 figures, more than enough to turn temptation into reality. He angled the screen toward Jennings. Would this be sufficient? Jennings froze. Charles's thumb slid again, the number swelling into 6 figures. The doctor's eyes flickered, shame and greed colliding behind them. What did she ever do to you? Jennings whispered, that you could speak so coldly of her. Charles gave a crooked grin. That's none of your concern, Doctor. I'm not paying you to judge me. I'm paying you to make sure she doesn't get better. Jennings turned away, shaken, muttering something about God and conscience. But Charles's voice followed him, smooth and certain. Think it over. Your bills won't pay themselves. And remember, this conversation never happened. The surgeon left, shoulders stiff, while Charles returned to Eleanor's bedside. He brushed a hand over her limp fingers, his expression utterly devoid of tenderness now. Stay quiet, darling, he whispered coldly. Just the way I need you. What neither man realized was that Eleanor, trapped in the prison of her unmoving body, had heard every word. Her mind, though clouded, was awake, her spirit thrumming with fury. She could not lift a finger or open her eyes. But she knew, and in that moment, beneath the hum of machines and the scent of white roses, the true battle began. Inside the quiet hospital room, Eleanor Whitaker's body remained perfectly still, but her mind burned with a storm of awareness. She was trapped, conscious within the prison of her coma. She could hear, she could think, she could remember, but her limbs would not respond. The sound of Charles's whisper, cruel and gloating, echoed again and again in her head. It had not been a nightmare. He had truly said those words. Fear rippled through her, but behind it came something fiercer, a pulse of disbelief, a betrayal so sharp it nearly suffocated her. She longed to scream, to sit up and confront him, to call for help. Yet her tongue lay heavy, her lips frozen. Her fingers twitched almost imperceptibly, but that was all. She was helpless. In that darkness, memories surged forward, as if her mind clung to them to keep from unraveling. She was 5 again, standing at the threshold of a weathered orphanage in Savannah, rain falling in silver sheets. She had been left with nothing but a basket and a name given by strangers. The loneliness of those years had carved itself into her bones. And then late, a couple had stepped into her life. Nicholas and Marjorie Hayes, engineers with kind eyes and steady hands. They had brought her into their modest home, a brick house in a quiet neighborhood shaded by oaks. For the first time, Eleanor had a bedroom with curtains she could call her own, and a mother who tucked her in with stories, a father who proudly introduced her to neighbors as his daughter. Her grandmother in that new family, Aunt Violet, had been her special joy. Violet tended a small garden on the edge of town, coaxing herbs and flowers from the Georgia soil. To Eleanor, it was a magical place. She remembered following the old woman among rows of lavender and rosemary, believing every sprig held secret power. Life will test you, child, Violet had told her once, pressing a tiny flower into her palm. But love will always be stronger than cruelty. The memory tightened in Eleanor's chest, binding past and present. That love, those years of warmth and encouragement, were why she could not surrender now. Even if her body betrayed her, her spirit would not. She repeated it silently like a vow. I will not let him win. I will not give him the company, the legacy, my life. Her breath rasped faintly through the oxygen tube. Inside, rage grew stronger than fear. She willed her body to move, to fight. A flicker in her jaw, the faintest shift of her tongue. Small victories, but they ignited hope. The door clicked shut softly. Charles had left. For a brief moment, Eleanor thought the torment was over. But then she heard it, the smooth slide of his voice, lowered for secrecy, but clear as glass in the quiet hallway just outside her door. "Yeah, Lydia, I'm still at the hospital," Charles murmured into his phone. "Don't worry, I'll stop by tonight. There's just one more thing. I need to meet with our attorney. I want to know exactly what rights I'll have over Eleanor's estate once she's gone." Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs, the monitor quickening in response. Lydia Moore. The name was like poison. The woman she had once glimpsed at a company gala. A socialite with a perfect smile and calculating eyes. She had suspected nothing then. Now the truth landed like a blow. While Eleanor fought for her life, her husband whispered endearments to his mistress and plotted how to spend her fortune. Charles chuckled softly into the phone. "Yes, darling, I'm sure. She won't make it. The doctors practically admitted as much. A month, maybe less. Then it's all ours. We'll celebrate properly. Buy that leather jacket you wanted. We'll mark the occasion." Every word seared Eleanor's mind. Her muscles trembled with the effort to react, to shatter the illusion of her helplessness. Her lips quivered, almost forming a sound. She tasted blood where she bit the inside of her cheek, the metallic tang reminding her she was alive, fighting. Rage flared so hot it eclipsed the pain in her head. She imagined her grandmother's voice, her adoptive father's proud smile, her mother's gentle touch. Their love surged through her like fire, pushing against the heavy chains of paralysis. She could not rise, not yet. But inside, her soul was standing tall, fierce and unbroken. In the dim hospital light, Eleanor remained motionless, a fragile figure surrounded by machines. Yet her mind burned with clarity. She had heard everything. She knew. And though Charles believed she was nothing more than a silent witness to her own demise, deep within, Eleanor swore she would survive. She would find a way. This was no longer just a fight for her health. It was a battle for her very life, her name, her legacy. And it had only just begun. The fluorescent lights in the corridor flickered as the night shift deepened into silence. In room 412, machines still hummed their rhythm, but something subtle had changed. Grace Turner, the youngest nurse on duty, leaned over to adjust Eleanor Whitaker's foreline and paused. Her sharp eyes caught it, an almost imperceptible tremor in Eleanor's lips, a flutter beneath her eyelids. "Mrs. Whitaker," Grace whispered, her voice uncertain. She bent closer, studying the woman who had lain unresponsive for days. At first she thought it was fatigue playing tricks on her, but then Eleanor's lips moved again, this time shaping the faintest breath of sound. Grace's heart stuttered. She lowered her ear until it nearly brushed Eleanor's mouth. The words were broken, strained yet unmistakable. "Don't trust him," Grace froze, the chill running down her spine more real than the air conditioning. "Who?" she asked softly, glancing toward the door. With effort that seemed to drain every ounce of strength, Eleanor forced the words out. "Charles and Doctor." The young nurse's eyes widened, horror dawning as she pieced together what those fragile syllables meant. Charles Whitaker, the grieving husband everyone admired for his devotion, and Dr. Harold Jennings, her own superior. Eleanor was accusing them of betrayal. Grace swallowed hard, her training telling her to dismiss delirium, but her instinct screamed otherwise. Something in Eleanor's eyes, weak though they were, burned with clarity. This wasn't confusion. It was a warning. "Are you saying they want to harm you?" Grace asked, voice shaking. Eleanor blinked slowly, a single tear slipping from the corner of her eye. It was all the answer Grace needed. She clutched the bed rail, steadying herself against the shock. The walls of the hospital suddenly felt sinister, the sterile corridors tainted by secrets she had never dared imagine. "Dear God," Grace murmured. They'll never believe me if I tell anyone. Not against him. Not against Dr. Jennings. She looked back at Eleanor, determination sparking in her chest. But I believe you. I'll help you. Eleanor's lips parted again, each word scraped from the depths of her pain. Need out. Grace glanced at the monitors, then at the closed door. She bent down quickly, pulling a notepad from her pocket. On it, she scribbled an address in looping handwriting. Aunt Lucille, she whispered. She lives out near Waycross in the countryside. Folks call her a healer. Some laugh, but I've seen her remedies work. If anyone can give you a chance outside this place, it's her. She slipped the paper beneath Eleanor's hand, curling the woman's fingers around it as though the motion were merely a comforting gesture. But to get you there… Grace hesitated, her mind racing. Then resolve settled over her. We'll have to move before dawn. The security guards change shifts around 4. That's when the halls are quietest. Eleanor strained, trying to nod, but only managed the faintest twitch. Grace reached for a syringe, drawing up a measured dose of medication. This will give you a bit of strength, she explained, her voice low. Not much, but enough to help you hold on. The needle slipped into Eleanor's foreline, and warmth spread through her fragile body. The fog in her mind thinned, and for the first time since the diagnosis, she felt a thread of hope coil tightly within her. Grace leaned close, her young face etched with courage beyond her years. Listen to me, Mrs. Whitaker. You are not alone. Tonight we fight back. Eleanor wanted to thank her, to pour out the torrent of gratitude rising in her chest, but all she managed was the whisper of a breath. Hope. Grace smiled faintly, squeezing her hand. Yes, hope. Outside the room, footsteps echoed. Charles returning from a late-night call, perhaps, or Dr. Jennings making his rounds. Grace straightened instantly, masking her expression with professional calm. But inside, her heart pounded with a secret vow. By dawn, Eleanor would no longer be a silent prisoner of room 412. She would be on her way to freedom, and Charles Whitaker would never see it coming. And though Eleanor's body trembled with pain, her spirit burned brighter. She lay waiting in the dim glow of machines, her husband's betrayal echoing in her ears. But now another sound cut through the despair, the whisper of a young nurse's promise. For the first time, Eleanor believed she might survive. The hospital was never truly quiet, but in the deep hours before dawn, it came closest. The overhead lights dimmed to a muted glow, the distant shuffle of night staff softened to whispers, and the steady hum of machines formed the soundtrack of a place that never slept. In room 412, Eleanor Whitaker drew in shallow breaths, her body frail, but her mind sharp with a single thought: escape. Grace Turner slipped into the room with practiced ease, her sneakers silent on the tile floor. Her hair was pulled back under a plain cap, her uniform jacket exchanged for a dark hoodie that disguised her in shadow. In her pocket rattled the keys she had borrowed from the supply closet, her heart pounding each time the metal chimed. She closed the door gently, leaning close to Eleanor's bed. It's time, she whispered. Eleanor's eyelids fluttered open, heavy with exhaustion. She tried to move, her arms trembling as if every muscle had forgotten its purpose. Grace steadied her, sliding an arm beneath her shoulders. Slowly. We'll take it slow. The monitors beeped in protest as Eleanor shifted. Grace quickly disconnected the leads, her fingers steady despite the rush of adrenaline. She shut down the machines one by one, silencing their alarms. The room sank into eerie stillness. Supporting most of Eleanor's weight, Grace helped her to her feet. The woman swayed like a leaf in the wind, her knees buckling, but sheer determination kept her upright. Grace whispered encouragements, her voice urgent, yet gentle. Just a few steps at a time. You can do this. They slipped into the hallway, every sound magnified, the squeak of Eleanor's slippers, the soft thud of Grace's steps. the distant ring of a phone at the nurse's station. They paused at each corner, listening for footsteps. Twice, Grace pressed Eleanor against the wall as orderlies passed by, pushing carts heavy with supplies. By the time they reached the service exit, Eleanor was trembling violently, sweat beading on her pale forehead. Her breathing rasped, shallow and ragged, and Grace feared she might collapse. But Eleanor's eyes, though half closed, burned with an unyielding fire. At the heavy steel door, Grace fumbled with the keys, her hands slick with nervous sweat. Finally, the lock clicked open. Cool night air swept in, carrying the scent of wet asphalt and pine from the Savannah outskirts. Eleanor inhaled deeply, the first breath of freedom after days of suffocating betrayal. Beyond the parking lot, the city stretched in silence, street lamps casting long shadows across the deserted road. Grace helped Eleanor to a bench by the bus stop at the edge of the hospital grounds. "This is where I leave you," Grace whispered, tears gathering in her eyes. "I've called in a favor. The bus driver knows to wait a minute longer tonight. He won't ask questions." She pressed Eleanor's cold hands between hers. "You'll go to Aunt Lucille. She'll know what to do." Eleanor wanted to speak, to pour out her gratitude, but only managed a broken whisper. "Thank you." Grace shook her head, smiling through her tears. "Don't thank me. Just live. Show him he didn't win." She kissed Eleanor's forehead softly, then turned, slipping back into the shadows of the hospital, vanishing as silently as she had come. Moments later, the bus lumbered to a halt with a hiss of brakes. The driver, a broad-shouldered man with kind eyes, glanced at Eleanor's fragile figure as he lowered the steps. Without a word, he helped her aboard. She sank into a seat by the window, her body weak, but her spirit clinging fiercely to consciousness. The ride was long, the city lights giving way to winding roads and darkened countryside. Eleanor's head lolled against the glass, each jolt of the bus rattling through her bones. She pressed the folded paper with Aunt Lucille's address against her chest, as if it were a talisman. Her vision blurred. More than once, she nearly slipped into unconsciousness. But the thought of Charles's whisper, of Lydia's laugh, kept her awake. At last, the bus screeched to a stop near a dirt road lined with oaks. The driver nodded toward the lane. "That's as close as I can get. Someone's waiting for you." Through the haze of her exhaustion, Eleanor saw a figure at the roadside, a woman wrapped in a shawl, her hair silver beneath the moonlight. Aunt Lucille stood tall despite her years, her gaze sharp, as if she had expected Eleanor all along. The healer moved quickly, her arms strong as she caught Eleanor when her legs gave way. Eleanor sagged into her embrace, the last of her strength fleeing. "Child," Aunt Lucille murmured, her voice deep and steady, "you made it this far. God isn't done with you yet." Eleanor's eyes fluttered shut, her body surrendering to the darkness at last. Safe in the old woman's arms, she slipped into oblivion, not of despair, but of fragile hope, carried into a future she could not yet see. The little farmhouse sat at the edge of a quiet Georgia field, its porch wrapped in vines of honeysuckle, its windows glowing faintly with the warmth of kerosene lamps. When Eleanor awoke, it was in a small room filled with the scent of herbs and dried flowers hanging from the rafters. Jars lined the shelves, their labels handwritten in neat, looping script. Somewhere nearby, the murmur of prayer blended with the rustle of leaves against the siding. Aunt Lucille sat by her bed, her dark skin illuminated by the lamplight, her silver hair bound in a scarf. She pressed a cloth steeped in a pungent infusion against Eleanor's temple, humming softly. When Eleanor stirred, confusion clouded her weak eyes. "You're safe now," Lucille said firmly, as though the words themselves carried healing. "But it'll be a long road back. You've been broken, child, but not beyond repair." At first, Eleanor recoiled from the strange concoctions Lucille offered. Teas bitter with roots she could not name, poultices of crushed herbs. whispered prayers over her weary body. It all seemed like remnants of another world, far from the polished clinics and sterile procedures she had always trusted. Yet, day by day, as Lucille tended her with unwavering patience, something shifted. The pain in her head dulled. Her strength returned in fragile increments. Morning after morning, Lucille insisted she sit by the window to drink in the light. "Sun heals more than you know," she would say, setting a cup of steaming brew in Eleanor's hands. In the evenings, she prayed aloud, her voice a steady rhythm that wrapped around Eleanor like a quilt. Weeks blurred into months. Muscles that had withered began to stir again, first with trembling steps across the wooden floor, then with careful walks along the porch. Lucille watched with quiet pride, correcting her posture, pressing her to push just a little further each day. By the third month, Eleanor could stand in the kitchen, chopping vegetables, while Lucille stirred a simmering pot. By the fifth, she ventured into the fields, her lungs filling with the sweet southern air. Each breath reminded her she was alive. Each step carried her further from the woman who had lain helpless in a hospital bed. But healing the body was only half the battle. At night, when the farmhouse grew silent, Eleanor lay awake, memories rushing back with venom. Charles's whisper, the best birthday gift you could ever give me, and Lydia's name, murmured with such certainty. Rage surged through her veins, as potent as any medicine. She would close her eyes, torn between the peace she found in the rhythm of prayer and the fire of vengeance that refused to die. "Forgive, and you'll find freedom," Lucille reminded her often, sensing the storm within. But Eleanor's heart was not ready. She prayed. Yes, she sang with the congregation at the small white church down the lane, and she felt strength flow through her again. Yet beneath that strength lay a blade, sharpened and waiting. 9 months passed. The seasons turned, the fields greened, the air grew heavy with summer heat, then cooled again into crisp autumn mornings. Eleanor's hair had grown long. Her skin regained its glow, and her voice, once faint, carried steady when she read scripture aloud with the choir. Neighbors at church whispered that she was a miracle, a living testament to God's grace. Eleanor smiled politely, bowing her head in humility, but inside she carried another truth. Her survival was not only grace, it was defiance. Every hymn she sang, every step she took, was a refusal to let Charles win. One Sunday, as the choir's voices rose in harmony, Eleanor felt both currents at once, the peace of belonging and the restless hunger for justice. Her hands trembled around the hymnal, and she whispered silently to herself, "I will forgive when the time comes. But first, I will be heard." Lucille watched her from the pew, eyes wise and knowing. She said nothing, but Eleanor sensed she understood. Healing had brought her back to life, but vengeance was what kept her moving forward. By the end of those 9 months, Eleanor was no longer the frail woman who had collapsed on a stranger's doorstep. She was reborn, her body renewed, her spirit stronger, her eyes clear. Yet deep inside, the wound remained, and she knew, with the certainty of someone who had clawed her way back from death, that the time would come when she would face her betrayer again. For now, she walked the narrow dirt road home from church, the evening light gilding the fields around her. She breathed deeply, savoring the air, the freedom, the quiet. But in the silence of her heart, one thought burned steady and unshaken. Charles Whitaker would pay for what he had done. The air in the Georgia countryside had grown sharp with the onset of winter, the evenings carrying the scent of wood smoke from chimneys scattered across the fields. Eleanor had found a rhythm to her days, helping Aunt Lucille tend the herb garden, singing with the church choir, walking the dirt roads at dusk. She was alive, she was whole again, but inside her, something still simmered. One night, as she returned from a service at the little white church, she heard muffled cries drifting from a small house at the edge of town. The sound froze her steps. It was the desperate sobbing of a child. She followed it, her heart tightening with each step until she reached the weathered porch of a shack lit by a single bare bulb. Through the open window came the crash of glass and a woman's slurred voice, dripping with rage. "Shut up, you useless boy." Then came another sound, a slap, followed by a stifled whimper. Eleanor's chest burned. Without thinking, she pushed the door open. Inside, the air reeked of liquor. A woman slumped in a chair, a bottle dangling from her hand, her face flushed with drink. In the corner, curled on the floor, was a boy no older than 6, his arms shielding his head. "Enough!" Eleanor's voice rang out, sharper than she expected. The woman blinked at her, startled, then muttered something incoherent before stumbling into another room, bottle in tow. Eleanor knelt beside the boy. His cheeks were streaked with tears, his lips split. When she reached for him, he flinched, but then his wide eyes met hers, eyes so full of pain it hollowed her. She softened her tone. "You're safe now. No one's going to hurt you while I'm here." The boy trembled, then collapsed against her chest, clinging to her with desperate strength. His small body shook, but his voice was steady when he whispered a single word that pierced her heart. "Mom." Eleanor froze, tears pricking her eyes. She held him tighter, rocking gently. "I'm not your mother," she whispered, though the word warmed and shattered her in equal measure. "But I'll take care of you." From that night, the boy shadowed her steps. She brought him to Lucille's farmhouse, fed him warm meals, wrapped him in blankets that smelled of lavender. Slowly, laughter returned to his voice, and though it was fragile, it was real. He began to call her Mom without hesitation, as if his soul had chosen her. Weeks later, a knock rattled the farmhouse door. Eleanor opened it to find a tall man, his clothes coated in coal dust, his eyes rimmed with exhaustion. He introduced himself as Thomas Green, the boy's father. He had been working double shifts at the mine, sending money home, never suspecting the truth of what had unfolded in his absence. When he saw his son, fed, clean, sleeping peacefully on the sofa, his shoulders sagged with relief. But then his gaze found Eleanor, and something unspoken passed between them. Gratitude, heavy and raw. "I don't know how to thank you," Thomas said, his voice low, roughened by years of labor. "If you hadn't stepped in, I don't even want to think about it." Eleanor shook her head. No thanks needed. He just needed someone to stand up for him. Anyone would have done the same. But Thomas didn't look convinced. His eyes lingered, searching her face as though he could see the battles she carried within herself. He came by often after that, sometimes to share supper, sometimes just to talk while his son played in the yard. The boys' laughter rang through the fields, and the farmhouse, once quiet, now brimmed with life. Between Eleanor and Thomas, trust grew. It was tentative at first, fragile as the boys' laughter, but it deepened with every passing week. She found herself drawn to his steadiness, his unassuming kindness. He, in turn, seemed to sense the fire that lived beneath her calm exterior, never pushing, simply offering presence. Yet, when their eyes met too long, when silence stretched between them heavy with possibilities, Eleanor's heart pulled back. She could not give herself to anyone yet, not while Charles still lived free, not while the memory of his betrayal haunted her nights. So she smiled when Thomas thanked her. She laughed when the boy tugged her hand and called her Mom. But when she lay awake in the quiet farmhouse, her thoughts returned to Savannah, to the man who had vowed she would never rise again. Her body was healed. Her soul was mending. But her story was not finished. While Eleanor rebuilt her strength in the quiet of Georgia's countryside, Charles Whitaker was living as though he had already won the world. In Savannah, his townhouse pulsed with noise, lavish parties, endless bottles of champagne, and Lydia Moore draped in jewels she had not earned. They floated through the city's social circles like royalty, Lydia's laughter echoing across ballroom floors while Charles basked in the illusion of control. But beneath the glittering surface, cracks widened. Whitaker construction, The company Eleanor had built with sweat and brilliance was faltering under his reckless hand. Charles had no head for contracts, no patience for negotiations, no respect for the crews who had once trusted Eleanor implicitly. Deals collapsed, projects stalled, and the company's reputation, once sterling, began to corrode. Board members whispered behind closed doors. Investors quietly withdrew. The men Charles had once boasted to at the golf club now avoided his eye. Still, he swaggered through meetings, brushing off their concerns with careless grins. "Losses happen," he would say, waving a hand heavy with a new gold watch. "We'll bounce back. Besides, I've got bigger plans on the horizon." Those plans had nothing to do with salvaging the company. Charles's mind was consumed with Lydia, with the life he imagined at her side. He promised her the world. Mansions, yachts, vacations along the Amalfi Coast, all funded by an inheritance he believed was already his. The fact that Eleanor's signature still decorated half the company's founding papers never crossed his mind. He had convinced himself she was as good as dead. Lydia played her part perfectly, encouraging his delusions. She paraded on his arm at every gala, every charity auction, her beauty distracting from the murmurs of discontent surrounding his failing business. Together, they embodied the spectacle Savannah's elite both craved and despised. Wealth flaunted with no foundation, love without loyalty. By late spring, Whitaker Construction was hemorrhaging money. Skilled employees left in droves, projects bled red ink, and creditors circled like vultures. Yet, Charles refused to acknowledge the storm. Instead, he threw himself into planning the one event he believed would secure his place among Savannah's upper crust, his wedding to Lydia Moore. It would be the grandest affair the city had seen in years. He booked the ballroom of the most prestigious hotel downtown, ordered custom suits from New York, and spared no expense on Lydia's gown, a masterpiece of silk and pearls. Every florist, baker, and musician of note was contracted. The wedding announcement filled glossy magazine pages, Lydia's smile gracing the cover as though she were already a queen. The press coverage was impossible to escape. Local newspapers speculated on the guest list: judges, senators, old money families whose names carried weight. Society pages gushed over the extravagance, the sheer audacity of throwing such a spectacle, while the business world whispered about Charles's mounting failures. It was one of those very papers that landed in Eleanor's hands on a quiet morning in Aunt Lucille's farmhouse. She had been sipping tea, sunlight spilling across the wooden table, when the headline caught her eye: "Whitaker More Union Promises, Savannah's Wedding of the Year." Her fingers tightened on the page until it crumpled. There, smiling from the newsprint, were Charles and Lydia, his hand on her waist, her diamond ring glinting beneath the photographer's flash. Eleanor's breath caught. Months of healing, months of prayer and reflection, had not dulled the memory of Charles's betrayal. Seeing him celebrated, exalted, flaunting his triumph, it was a wound ripped open anew. But this time, anger was not the only force that rose within her. Resolve burned hotter. She read every line of the article, her sharp eyes absorbing each detail: the date, the venue, the guest list. A plan began to form, clear and unwavering. For months she had hidden, gathering strength, biding her time. Now the moment had come. She folded the paper carefully, pressing it flat as though sealing a vow. Aunt Lucille watched her from across the table, recognizing the change in her posture, the set of her jaw. "You've made up your mind," Lucille said softly. Eleanor met her gaze, her voice calm but edged with steel. "Yes, I'm going back to Savannah." The old woman nodded, neither surprised nor disapproving. "Then go with truth in your hands, child. Let it be your weapon." That night, Eleanor lay awake, staring at the ceiling beams of the farmhouse. She thought of Thomas Green and his boy, of the laughter she had found in their company. She thought of the hymns sung in the little white church. She thought of her adoptive father's steady pride and her grandmother's words. Love will always be stronger than cruelty. But love, she knew now, could also take the shape of justice. When dawn painted the sky in streaks of rose and gold, Eleanor packed a small bag. Her body was no longer frail. Her spirit, though still scarred, stood tall. She left the farmhouse with Aunt Lucille's blessing echoing in her ears, the newspaper folded neatly inside her satchel. She was ready to walk back into the city that had tried to bury her, ready to face Charles Whittaker and reveal the truth he thought would stay silent forever. The stage was set, and this time the performance would not end in applause. It would end in ruin. The grand ballroom of Savannah's most prestigious hotel glittered with chandeliers that rained light across marble floors. Dozens of floral arrangements, orchids, roses, lilies, perfumed the air, their extravagance a display of wealth rather than sentiment. Guests in tailored suits and shimmering gowns murmured with anticipation as waiters moved gracefully between them, trays of champagne flutes catching the golden glow. It was the wedding of the year, and all of Savannah's elite had come to witness the spectacle. At the center of it all stood Charles Whittaker, immaculate in a tuxedo, his chest puffed with pride. Beside him, Lydia, more dazzled in her gown, a river of silk and pearls, her diamond ring catching every flicker of light. They were the picture of triumph, the powerful businessman and the glamorous socialite, ready to cement their union before the city's most influential eyes. But among the guests, unseen and unnoticed, stood Eleanor Whittaker. Her figure was cloaked in modest attire, a volunteer's uniform from the church choir assisting with the event. A plain dress, a simple scarf. No one looked at her twice. At her side walked the young boy she had once rescued, his hand small but steady in hers. Together, they blended into the quiet background of servers and attendants, their presence hidden beneath the weight of spectacle. Eleanor's heart thudded against her ribs as the ceremony unfolded. She watched Charles beam at Lydia, watched Lydia bask in the envy of the crowd. Rage simmered within her, but she held it firm, waiting for the moment. Her satchel, tucked safely against her side, carried everything she needed. Medical records she had painstakingly retrieved, documents Grace Turner had risked her career to provide, and financial statements exposing Charles's embezzlement. The officiant's voice rang out, solemn yet theatrical. If anyone here knows any reason these two should not be joined in holy matrimony, speak now or forever hold your peace. Silence followed, heavy and expectant. Charles's smile broadened. Lydia squeezed his hand, and the guests leaned forward, ready for the final vows. It was then that Eleanor stepped forward. Her heels clicked softly against the polished floor as she crossed the aisle, the boy at her side. At first, only a few heads turned, puzzled by the intrusion of a volunteer into such a sacred moment. But then whispers spread, rippling outward like waves on water. Faces shifted from curiosity to recognition. Charles's eyes widened, his jaw slack. For a heartbeat, he looked as though he had seen a ghost. Lydia's fingers tightened on his arm, her expression faltering as she recognized the woman who was supposed to be dead. Eleanor. Charles's voice cracked, disbelief strangling him. Gasps swept through the crowd. Phones lifted, cameras flashed. The story of the year had just rewritten itself in real time. Eleanor reached the front, her movements steady, her eyes never leaving Charles. She took the microphone from the stunned officiant, her voice trembling at first, but gaining strength with each word. "My name," she said, her gaze sweeping the crowd, "is Eleanor Whittaker. Yes, Eleanor. The wife Charles buried in whispers and lies. The woman he prayed would never wake again." A hush fell, the kind that demanded every ear. "You sit here today," she continued, her voice sharp, "to witness a wedding built on betrayal. But before you raise your glasses to toast, you should know the truth. Charles Whittaker conspired with Dr. Harold Jennings to keep me in a coma, to let me die so he could inherit my company, my money, my life. The ballroom erupted with shocked murmurs. Lydia recoiled, horror flickering across her perfect mask. Eleanor pulled papers from her satchel, unfolding them with deliberate care. These are my medical records. Records altered under his instruction. And here, she held up another sheet, her voice cutting clear, are financial statements. Proof that while I lay unconscious, Charles drained accounts, siphoned funds, and lined his pockets, while Whitaker Construction collapsed. Charles lunged toward her, but the boy at Eleanor's side clung to her hand, and she stood unmoved. Security stepped forward, but the guests themselves held them back, curiosity rooting them to the spectacle. And if you doubt my word, Eleanor added, her tone steady as steel, asked Grace Turner, a nurse who risked everything to save me, to bring me here today. She heard what I heard. She saw what I saw. The crowd turned, eyes darting between Charles and Lydia, judgment heavy in the air. A senator's wife whispered furiously to her husband. A banker shook his head in disgust. Cameras continued to flash, capturing every second of Charles's unraveling. Lydia's face drained of color. She pulled her hand from Charles's grasp, stepping back as if distance could erase her complicity. You told me she was gone, she hissed under her breath, audible to the closest guests. Eleanor's gaze locked on Charles. You told me once that my silence was the greatest gift you could receive. But today, Charles, I give you something greater. The truth. The ballroom crackled with energy, shock, outrage, fascination. Guests rose from their seats, some shouting, some recording, all bearing witness to the collapse of a man who had thought himself untouchable. Charles's face twisted, his composure shattering. You don't know what you're saying, he stammered, his voice breaking. She's lying, all of it, but no one believed him. The evidence lay in Eleanor's hands. The witnesses stood ready, and the woman he had condemned had risen stronger than ever. The officiant cleared his throat, attempting to restore order. But the ceremony was over. The grand wedding, the glittering illusion, had crumbled into dust. Guests streamed toward the exits, murmuring about scandal, betrayal, and ruin. Lydia tore off her veil, fleeing through the side door, her dreams dissolving into shame. And Charles Whitaker, once the man who held Savannah's admiration, stood abandoned in the center of the ballroom, his empire gone, his reputation destroyed, his future reduced to nothing. Eleanor lowered the microphone, her chest rising with steady breath. The boy squeezed her hand tighter, and she looked down at him with a faint smile. For the first time since her coma, she felt whole. The revenge was complete. In the days that followed the disastrous wedding, Savannah buzzed with scandal. Newspapers that once praised Charles Whitaker now tore him apart with headlines sharp as knives. Society pages that had fawned over Lydia more ridiculed her as nothing more than a gold digger caught in her own web. Overnight, their names became synonymous with greed, deceit, and downfall. Whitaker Construction, already teetering under Charles's reckless leadership, collapsed entirely. The board of directors convened in emergency meetings. Lawyers swarmed the offices, and creditors closed in. Charles, once so arrogant, found himself ousted, his assets frozen, his empire crumbling to ash. The company Eleanor had built with her brilliance and sweat was rescued from his grasp, and though she no longer sought to control it, she took grim satisfaction in knowing it was finally free of him. Lydia Moore vanished from Savannah's ballrooms, her jewels pawned quietly, her friends scattering like startled birds. She became a cautionary tale whispered behind lace fans and over glasses of wine. Beauty without integrity could not buy respect. As for Charles, his fall was merciless. Stripped of wealth, abandoned by Lydia, and mocked by the very circles that had once embraced him, he disappeared into obscurity. Some said he fled to Atlanta. Others swore they had seen him boarding a bus heading west, a single suitcase in hand. Wherever he went, it was not with dignity but with disgrace, a man undone by his own ambition. Eleanor, however, did not linger in the city that had betrayed her. She returned to the countryside, the quiet farmhouse where Aunt Lucille's herbs still dried by the windows, where fields stretched endlessly beneath the sky. There, Thomas Green welcomed her with steady eyes, his son clinging to her hand as though she were already family. Life settled into a rhythm, both gentle and profound. Eleanor helped Thomas repair the old barn, her laughter rising easily now as the boy ran through the fields. Evenings were spent on the porch, the scent of honeysuckle drifting in the air. Thomas's voice low as he told stories of the mine, of resilience, of finding light in the dark. Between them, trust grew into something deeper, unhurried but undeniable. Thomas never pressed her, never demanded more than she was ready to give. He simply stood beside her, steady and kind, offering a love that asked for nothing but honesty. Slowly, Eleanor's walls softened, and in his presence she discovered a peace she had once thought impossible. On a Sunday morning, the little white church at the end of the lane filled with the voices of the congregation. The choir sang, sunlight poured through stained glass, and the scent of polished wood mixed with the sweetness of lilies. Eleanor walked down the aisle, not in satin or pearls, but in a simple dress, her hand held firmly by Thomas on one side and the boy on the other. The townsfolk smiled as they passed, whispering blessings, recognizing the quiet miracle that had unfolded among them. To them, this was not the scandal of Savannah, but the redemption of a woman who had endured the worst and risen with grace. At the front, they bowed their heads as the pastor prayed over them. Eleanor closed her eyes, a tear slipping free, not of sorrow, but of gratitude. She had lost everything once, yet here she stood, surrounded by a love that was true, a family that was hers not by chance but by choice. When the hymn began, her voice joined with the others, strong and steady. She looked at Thomas, at the boy who now called her mom, and her heart brimmed with certainty. The pain of betrayal had not vanished, but it had been transformed into strength, into resilience, into life. As they left the church, the morning sun bathed them in gold. Eleanor held Thomas's hand in one palm, the boy's in the other, their steps in rhythm as they walked down the path together. The story was no longer about loss or vengeance. It was about survival, about choosing love over despair, truth over lies. It was about beginning again, unafraid of the shadows. For even in betrayal and darkness, truth and life prevail. That night, the rain came down like the sky itself had opened. I stood on the porch of a rented cottage no bigger than a double garage, holding my little girl against my chest as if I could shield her from every storm in the world. She was asleep, her small breath warm against my neck, but my hands trembled. The truth was too heavy to ignore. We were alone, utterly alone. My name is Lily Thompson, and this is how I almost lost everything before I even had a chance to build a life worth living. I grew up thinking family meant safety, but I learned too early that not every roof with people inside could be called home. After my parents died in a car accident when I was 6, I was placed in foster care. Eventually, a couple named Brenda and Earl King took me in. On the surface, they looked like decent people, but inside those walls, kindness was a performance for social workers and neighbors. Behind closed doors, I was cheap labor with a bed in a dusty storage room. Every plate I scrubbed, every weed I pulled from their garden, was met not with thanks, but with reminders that I should be grateful I wasn't back at the group home. Still, I told myself it was temporary. One day, I would be old enough to leave, to earn my own living and make my own family. That thought kept me breathing, even when Brenda's voice cut sharp as a knife through the kitchen or when Earl slammed doors for no reason other than to remind me I was small and powerless. But the worst of it came the night her younger brother Roy showed up. He had just been released from prison and already had whiskey on his breath. I was 16, tall but still fragile, and I knew trouble when I saw it in someone's eyes. Roy looked at me like I was something he could take. That night, I learned what real fear feels like. Not the kind you get watching a scary movie, but the kind that burns into your chest because you know no one is coming to save you. I ran. Out the back door, across the yard, barefoot on gravel, rain soaking my clothes and blurring my vision. I don't remember deciding to run. I just knew I had to get away. I slipped near the fence and skinned my knee, but I didn't stop. And then, out of nowhere, a voice called, "Hey, leave her alone." I spun around and saw a young man stepping out from under a tree, holding what looked like a BB gun. Roy cursed, spat into the mud, and turned back toward the house, muttering something I couldn't hear. The stranger walked toward me, rain dripping off the brim of his cap. "You okay?" he asked. I wanted to say yes, but my teeth chattered too hard to form words. He crouched, saw my bleeding knee, and said softly, "Let's get you somewhere warm. My grandmother lives just down the road. She'll know what to do." That's how I met Jason Harris, the man who, though I didn't know it then, would one day save both me and my little girl in ways I couldn't imagine. That night, I followed him through the rain, too exhausted to argue, too scared to go back, and too desperate to believe that maybe, just maybe, someone finally cared. Jason's grandmother lived in a small white house with green shutters and a porch swing that creaked softly in the wind. When we stepped inside, the smell of chamomile and fresh-baked bread wrapped around me like a blanket. For a moment, it felt like stepping into another world, a world where no one yelled or slammed doors just to remind you how little you mattered. "Jason? Who's this?" A warm voice called from the kitchen. An older woman appeared, wiping her hands on a floral apron. Her hair was silver, but her eyes were bright, kind, and full of questions. "This is Lily," Jason said gently. "She's hurt. Can we use the first aid kit?" The woman, Grandma Ruth, nodded and without hesitation guided me to the kitchen table. Her hands were soft, her voice steady as she examined my knee. "It's not too deep," she said, dabbing at the blood. "Just a scrape, but we'll clean it up. Sit still, sweetheart." Sweetheart. That word nearly undid me. It had been years since anyone called me something like that. Jason crouched beside me, holding the antiseptic wipes, his expression focused but tender. "Sorry about my uncle's gun scaring you," he said. "It's just a pellet gun." I figured the sight of it would make him back off. I shook my head. "You didn't scare me." He did. My voice cracked, and I hated that it did. Jason didn't push. He simply nodded, like he understood more than I was saying. Grandma Ruth poured hot tea and slid it across the table. "Drink this. You're trembling." I wrapped my hands around the mug and stared down at it, afraid to look up, afraid I'd start crying and wouldn't be able to stop. Jason sat across from me. "You don't have to go back there tonight, you know," he said softly. "If you don't feel safe." Safe. The word felt foreign on my tongue, like something people in movies talked about, not girls like me. "I don't have anywhere else," I whispered. Grandma Ruth leaned forward, her gaze kind but firm. "Honey, you're not sleeping in that house tonight. You can stay here. We've got a spare room. Jason will drive you to the social services office in the morning if you want. They need to know what's happening." The thought of going back to the King's house made my stomach turn. I saw Roy's eyes in my mind, wild, mean, and full of something I didn't want to name. "Okay," I said, barely audible. Jason smiled slightly, a warmth in his eyes that caught me off guard. "You made the right choice." I stayed that night in a small guest room that smelled faintly of lavender and old wood. Grandma Ruth brought me an extra quilt and fussed over my pillow until it was just right. I lay there in the dark, listening to the rain on the roof, and for the first time in years, I didn't fall asleep afraid. I fell asleep hopeful. What I didn't know then was that this night would be a turning point, that meeting Jason and Grandma Ruth would plant a seed of change in me. It wouldn't bloom overnight, but it was the start of something I had never experienced before. The start of believing life could be different. The morning light in Grandma Ruth's house felt different, softer, warmer, as if it carried a promise I hadn't felt in years. I woke up to the smell of biscuits, baking, and coffee brewing, and for a moment, I forgot where I was. Then it came back, the running, the rain, Roy's eyes, Jason's voice telling me I'd be safe. When I stepped into the kitchen, Grandma Ruth was already setting the table. "Morning, sweetheart," she said with the kind of cheer that sounded genuine, not forced. "Sit, eat. You look like you haven't had a good breakfast in a while." She wasn't wrong. I hadn't had a breakfast that wasn't cold cereal or day-old bread in. I couldn't remember how long. I sat quietly while she handed me scrambled eggs, bacon, and a biscuit still warm enough to melt butter on contact. Jason came in moments later, fresh from the morning air, his hair damp from a quick shower. "You sleep okay?" he asked, glancing at me. I nodded, though my throat tightened. Better than I had in years. After breakfast, Jason drove me to the social services office, the one place I had avoided since leaving the group home. My hands shook in my lap as we pulled into the parking lot. "You don't have to go through with this if you're not ready," he said, his voice low, careful. "No, I'm ready," I whispered. "I can't keep living like that." Inside, a caseworker named Ms. Barnes listened while I explained everything. The chores, the yelling, the threats to send me back, and finally, Roy's attempt to corner me in my room. My voice trembled, but I forced myself to keep speaking. Jason sat beside me the whole time, silent but steady, like an anchor in a storm. When I finished, Ms. Barnes sighed and leaned back in her chair. "Lily, you don't have to go back there. We can move you into a group home until we find another placement. You did the right thing by coming here." Relief hit me so hard, I almost cried again. I had dreaded being sent back to that dark little room. Dreaded seeing Roy's smirk and Brenda's cold eyes. Now I wouldn't have to. Outside, Jason walked me to the car. "You okay?" he asked. "I think so," I said, staring at the pavement. "I don't know what's going to happen next, but it's better than what I had." He smiled and handed me a folded piece of paper. "My number. If you need anything or just want to talk, call me, okay? I mean it." That day, I returned to the group home, not as a scared little girl begging to be accepted, but as someone making her own choice. My room was small, shared with 2 other girls, but it was mine and no one yelled at me for existing. That night, lying in my new bed, I thought about Jason and his grandmother, about the way kindness could feel so unfamiliar and yet so natural once you let it in. For the first time in years, I didn't cry myself to sleep. I closed my eyes and let a thought take root in me. Maybe life didn't have to stay this way forever. Maybe there was still something worth hoping for. Life at the group home was nothing like the King household. It wasn't perfect, rules were strict, curfews tight, and privacy rare, but it was fair. For the first time in years, I didn't have to earn my place by doing endless chores or fearing someone's temper. I had a bed, meals 3 times a day, and people who were there for the same reason as me, to survive and find something better. My roommates were Jenna and Chloe. Jenna was my age, with sharp wit and an energy that filled every room. Chloe was younger, shy and quiet, always reading in the corner. Jenna quickly decided we were going to be friends whether I liked it or not, and honestly, I didn't mind. It felt good to have someone who didn't look at me like a burden. Still, I kept my guard up at first. Years of being told I was lucky to even have a roof over my head had carved deep habits into me. I flinched at raised voices, even when they weren't angry. I said sorry far too often, but bit by bit, the group homes softened those edges. I joined sewing classes in the evenings, partly because it gave me something to do, partly because I loved the rhythm of a needle and thread. Creating something new out of scraps felt symbolic, like maybe I could stitch together the pieces of myself too. Jason kept his promise. He came by every week, sometimes with cookies from Grandma Ruth, sometimes just to say hi. He'd sit with me on the front steps, talking about his pre-med studies and how he wanted to help people one day, to fix what's broken inside and out. His eyes lit up when he talked about it, and I found myself smiling in ways I hadn't in years. Grandma Ruth even visited once, hugging me like she'd known me forever. "Your family now, honey," she said, and I believed her. For someone who had spent so many years feeling unwanted, those words sank deep. Of course, not everything was perfect. Jenna had her own baggage, and sometimes her jokes about rich boys stung more than I let on. But I liked her. We stayed up late whispering about what we wanted from life. She dreamed of traveling the world. I dreamed of something simpler, a little home of my own, and a reason to never look back. For the first time, I started thinking about a future. I wanted to graduate, to find a trade, something solid that would keep me from ever needing people like Brenda and Earl again. Sewing was becoming more than a hobby, it was a plan. I wanted to be independent, to build something from my own hands. And slowly, I let myself imagine what it might be like to have someone like Jason in my life, not just as a friend, but as something more. I kept those thoughts private, though, because the idea of someone actually loving me felt too fragile to speak out loud. But deep down, something had changed. I wasn't that terrified girl running barefoot in the rain anymore. I was someone with a bed, with friends, with a dream. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was standing on my own feet and maybe, just maybe, moving towards something good. It's strange how the smallest moments can change everything. For me, it was the way Jason smiled when he saw me waiting on the steps of the group home one chilly afternoon. He had a paper bag in his hand, and I could smell fresh cinnamon rolls even before he reached me. "Thought you could use something sweet," he said, handing me the bag. I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it felt like no one had ever thought of me like that. Just because, not because they wanted something in return. That moment, something stirred deep inside me, something I had spent years burying. Jason and I started spending more time together. He'd tell me about college, about anatomy labs and late-night study sessions, about his dream of becoming a cardiologist. "Fixing hearts," he said one evening, sitting on the porch swing. "I guess I've always wanted to help people feel whole again." I wanted to tell him he'd already done that for me, that every small act of kindness was stitching my own broken heart back together. But the words caught in my throat. Instead, I just smiled, holding on to the moment. Jenna noticed. She was quick to pick up on any shift in energy. One night, as we lay in our bunks, she whispered, "You like him, don't you?" Heat rushed to my face. "He's just kind," I muttered. Jenna laughed softly. "Kind and cute. You think I don't see it." Her tone was teasing, but something in her eyes lingered longer than it should have. I ignored it, telling myself I was imagining things. A week later, Jason came by unexpectedly, leaving an envelope at the front desk because I wasn't there. Jenna was. When I returned, she acted like nothing happened. For days, I waited for Jason to mention it, but he didn't. Curiosity finally got the best of me, and I asked, "Did you leave something for me?" He frowned. "Yeah, note. You didn't get it." I shook my head and my stomach sank. That night, while Jenna was in the shower, I checked her side of the dresser. The envelope was there, ripped open. The note inside was simple, sweet. Had to leave for an internship abroad. "I'll miss you. Call me when you can." My hands trembled as I put it back. Jenna had read it, hidden it, and said nothing. She came in moments later, towel around her shoulders, and froze when she saw my face. "You went through my stuff," she snapped. "You stole my letter," I whispered. Her jaw tightened. "I was just looking out for you. Guys like him, Lily? They leave. They don't stick around for girls like us." The words cut deep. I wanted to scream, to demand why she thought she had the right to make that choice for me. Instead, I walked out, tears stinging my eyes. Jason left for that internship, and I didn't hear from him again for almost a year. Maybe Jenna was right. Maybe I wasn't the kind of girl someone stayed for. So I threw myself into sewing, into planning a future that didn't rely on anyone but me. But late at night, when the lights were out and the house was quiet, I couldn't stop wondering if Jason had really forgotten me, or if life was simply teaching me one more cruel lesson about trust. A year passed, and life moved on whether I wanted it to or not. I finished my sewing program, got a part-time job at a small alterations shop downtown, and focused on building something stable for myself. The group home started to feel less like a temporary shelter and more like a stepping stone toward the life I wanted. Still, there were nights I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering what had happened to Jason. Then, one crisp autumn afternoon, I was walking through Forsyth Park, enjoying the smell of roasted peanuts from a nearby vendor, when I heard someone call, "Lily." I turned, and there he was, Jason, older somehow, more sure of himself, but still with that same warm smile. I froze for a second, stunned. Then, before I could think, I ran to him and threw my arms around his neck. "Whoa," he laughed, hugging me back tightly. "Guess you missed me?" "You disappeared," I said, pulling back to look at him. "You didn't write, you didn't call." Jason frowned. "I left a letter before I flew out. You didn't get it." My chest tightened. "Jenna!" I whispered, suddenly understanding. He shook his head, an incredulous smile forming. "I should have known something was off. I kept waiting for you to call, but I figured maybe you didn't want to talk." We stood there in silence for a moment, and then he took a deep breath. "I'm sorry, Lily. I should have done more to make sure you knew how much you mean to me." I swallowed hard. "You mean?" Jason smiled, that easy, genuine smile I remembered. "I mean, I thought about you every single day while I was gone. And now that I'm back, I don't plan on disappearing again." We spent the whole afternoon walking and talking, catching up on everything we'd missed. Jason told me about his internship in New York, about working alongside top surgeons and how it solidified his dream of becoming a cardiologist. "I want to fix hearts, Lily. Literally, but also, in other ways." His eyes lingered on me when he said that, and something in my chest fluttered. That evening, he drove me back to the group home. When he stopped the car, I hesitated, hand on the door handle. "Jason, why me?" He looked at me like it was the easiest question in the world. "Because you're you. Strong, kind, beautiful. You've been through hell and still managed to care about people. How could I not fall for that?" The words hit me so hard I could barely breathe. For so long, I had convinced myself no one could ever see me as worthy, as someone to love. And yet here he was, saying it like it was obvious. We didn't kiss that night. We didn't need to. The way he touched my hand before I stepped out of the car was enough. It felt like the beginning of something real, something that could last, if I was brave enough to let it. That night, lying in bed, I realized something. For the first time in my life, I wasn't dreaming about someday. I was living it right now. When Jason told me he wanted me to meet his parents, I hesitated. "Are you sure?" I asked, twisting my hands together. "They don't even know me." "They will," he said, smiling like it was the easiest thing in the world. "And they'll love you, just like I do." The words "just like I do" hung in the air, warm and terrifying at the same time. No one had ever said that to me before. I nodded, hoping he was right, but a pit formed in my stomach anyway. A week later, we drove to his parents' estate, just outside Savannah. The Harris home was breathtaking. White columns, manicured gardens, and a porch big enough to host a wedding. For a moment, I stood frozen, clutching my simple purse, suddenly aware of my thrift store dress and scuffed shoes. Jason squeezed my hand. "You look perfect," he whispered, then led me inside. His mother, Eleanor, was the first to greet us. She was tall, elegant, and carried herself like someone who'd never been told no in her life. She looked me up and down, her lips pressing into a thin line. "This is Lily?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am," I said softly, trying to smile. "MMM," she murmured, then turned to Jason. "Dinner's ready." We sat at a long table that could have seated 20. His father, a serious man named Richard, asked polite but pointed questions. Where I lived, what I did for work, where I came from. I answered as best I could, my voice steady even as my chest tightened. When I mentioned sewing and alterations, Eleanor raised an eyebrow. So, not a college girl then? No, ma'am, I said quietly. I went to a vocational program. I see. She set down her wine glass. Jason, may I speak to you in private? Jason shook his head. Whatever you want to say, you can say it here. Her eyes flicked to me, cold and sharp. Jason, you're on your way to becoming a doctor. You have opportunities most people can only dream of, and you bring home. She gestured at me like I wasn't even in the room. This? A girl from a group home? Do you even know who her family is? Blood rushed to my face, and I struggled to breathe. Mrs. Harris, I said quietly, I know I'm not, but Jason cut me off. Enough, Mom. Lily's my choice, and I love her. The words should have made me happy, but all I felt was small and exposed. Eleanor's expression softened for a moment. Pity, not kindness, then hardened again. Love doesn't pay bills, Jason. One day, you'll thank me for saving you from a mistake. I couldn't take it. I stood up so fast the chair scraped against the floor. Thank you for dinner, I said, my voice trembling. I should go. Jason reached for my hand. Lily, but I pulled away, blinking back tears as I walked out of that pristine house. The cool night air hit my face, and I realized my chest hurt, not because of Eleanor's words, but because some part of me had believed them. Jason found me outside by the car. I'm so sorry, he whispered, wrapping his arms around me. They were wrong. You hear me? Wrong. I wanted to believe him, but a voice in the back of my mind whispered, people like you don't belong in houses like that. After that dinner, things between Jason and me grew complicated. He did everything he could to reassure me. Calls late at night, surprise visits with takeout when I was too tired to cook. Even flowers left at the group home's front desk. But no matter how kind he was, I couldn't shake the image of his mother's face, the way she looked at me as though I were some charity case he'd picked up on the street. A month later, I found out I was pregnant. I stared at the little blue plus sign on the test, sitting on the bathroom floor of my small apartment, my heart pounding so loudly it drowned out everything else. I should have been happy. This was our child, the result of a love I never thought I'd find. But instead, fear settled over me like a heavy quilt I couldn't push off. Would Jason still want me when he knew? Would his family use this as proof that I was trapping him? I waited 2 days before finally calling him. Can you come over? I asked, my voice shaky. He came immediately, smiling like he always did when he saw me. What's wrong? Are you okay? I handed him the test, unable to speak. His eyes widened, and for a second, I couldn't read his expression. Then he smiled and pulled me into a hug. We're having a baby. I nodded, tears streaming down my face. Lily, this is amazing, he said. We'll figure it out, okay? I'm with you, always. For a little while, I believed him. We talked about moving into a bigger place, about him picking up more shifts, about building a family together. I dared to let myself dream again until the day I saw him with her. It was raining, and I had taken an earlier bus home. As I stepped off near a coffee shop, I saw Jason inside, sitting across from Madison Clark, a polished blonde whose family owned half the real estate in Savannah. She was the girl his mother had once mentioned at dinner, the perfect match for him. They were laughing, leaning close, his hand resting near hers on the table. My stomach twisted. I froze there, watching through the glass like I was looking at someone else's life fall apart. When Jason spotted me, his face changed, surprise, guilt, something I couldn't name, and I ran before he could reach me. That night, his mother called me. I don't know how she got my number, but her voice was calm, almost sweet. Jason's a good man, she said, and he's going to do the right thing for his future. Madison is part of that future, dear. I thought you should know before you get hurt worse than you already are. Her words sliced through me. I didn't even argue. I just packed a bag and left. I didn't tell Jason where I was going. I didn't leave a note. I boarded the first bus out of Savannah and never looked back. I ended up in a small town 2 hours away, renting a single room above a sewing shop. When my daughter, Emma, was born, I held her tiny body against my chest and whispered, "It's just us now, baby girl. Just us." And I swore no one would ever hurt us again. Life as a single mother was nothing like I imagined. People romanticize it in movies. Those montages of a mom holding her baby while sunlight streams through the window, smiling like she's never been happier. In reality, it was exhausting, lonely, and terrifying. Emma was everything to me. From the moment I held her in my arms, I knew I would walk through fire for her. She had Jason's eyes, those warm hazel eyes that made my chest ache every time she looked at me. I didn't regret leaving. I told myself every night that walking away was the right choice. But deep down, there were nights I cried quietly after Emma finally drifted off, wondering if I had stolen something from her, a father who might have loved her. I worked at a small sewing shop, taking in alterations and mending clothes for people who didn't even know my name. The hours were long, the pay was low, but it was honest work, and it allowed me to rent a tiny studio apartment. The place was barely big enough for a crib and a mattress, but it was ours. As Emma grew, I started noticing little things. How she tired quickly after running, how her lips sometimes looked a little too pale. At first, I chalked it up to her being small for her age. But then came the day at the park when she collapsed on the grass after climbing the slide, clutching her chest. Panic took over. I scooped her up and rushed to the nearest urgent care. The doctor's face was grave as he listened to her heart. "She has a congenital heart defect," he said quietly, handing me a pamphlet with diagrams I couldn't bring myself to look at. "She's going to need surgery, soon." Surgery. The word echoed in my ears long after we left. How was I supposed to pay for surgery when I could barely cover rent and groceries? I tried not to let Emma see me cry, but some nights she'd toddle over, pat my cheek, and whisper, "It's okay, Mama." She was 4 years old and already comforting me. The community in that little town stepped up in small ways. Mrs. Porter, who owned the shop below my apartment, watched Emma for free when I worked late. The man at the corner store started slipping extra fruit into my grocery bag. Even so, no one could give me what I really needed. Enough money to save my little girl's life. I started taking extra sewing work, staying up past midnight to finish orders. My fingers bled from pinpricks, but I didn't care. I kept telling myself if I just pushed harder, worked longer, I could make it happen. But as Emma's condition worsened, the hope I clung to started slipping through my fingers like sand. One evening, after Emma had another fainting spell, I sat on the kitchen floor, holding her tiny body in my lap while she slept and whispered to the dark, "I can't lose her. I can't." That night, I prayed for the first time in years. I didn't pray for money or even for strength. I prayed for a miracle, something, anything to keep my daughter alive. The miracle I prayed for came on a day that began like any other until it didn't. Emma and I were at the park, one of her favorite places, even though she tired quickly. She was on the swings laughing, her little hands gripping the chains as I gently pushed her. "Higher, Mama," she giggled. But moments later, her laughter cut off. She clutched her chest, gasping for air, and then collapsed. My heart stopped. "Emma." I scooped her into my arms, panic blinding me. "Somebody help." I screamed. A man sprinted from across the park, medical bags slung over his shoulder. He knelt beside me, already pulling out equipment. "I'm a doctor," he said quickly. "Set her down now." I laid Emma on the grass, shaking. The man checked her pulse, then opened her airway. "She's going into arrhythmia," he muttered, working fast, attaching pads from a portable monitor to her chest. His movements were swift, precise, someone who knew exactly what to do. And then, as he looked up to reassure me, I froze. Those eyes hazel, warm, achingly familiar. "Jason." I whispered, stunned. He paused, recognition flashing across his face. "Lily?" But there was no time to process. He focused back on Emma, stabilizing her until her breathing steadied and her tiny chest rose and fell in rhythm again. When she finally opened her eyes, weak but conscious, I almost collapsed with relief. Jason carried her to his car. My clinic's 5 minutes away. We'll take her there now. I climbed into the back seat, clutching Emma, still too shocked to speak. The clinic was new and bright, clearly successful. Jason owned it. I could see his name on the wall. Dr. Jason Harris, cardiology specialist. He examined Emma thoroughly, reviewing her hospital records I had brought along. His face grew tight. She needs surgery soon. Without it, Lily, it's serious. I know, I said, my voice breaking. But I can't afford. You don't have to, he interrupted. I'll cover everything. She's my patient now. I stared at him. Jason, why? After all this time, he met my eyes, pain flickering in his expression. Because she's my daughter, isn't she? The words punched the air from my lungs. I couldn't answer, just nodded through tears. He sat down heavily, running a hand through his hair. I looked for you, Lily. For years. I thought you didn't want me, didn't want us. My mother! She told me you were with Madison. I whispered. His jaw tightened. Madison? That was a business lunch, nothing more. My mother, she wanted me with someone suitable. I had no idea she reached out to you. Silence stretched between us, filled with all the years we had lost. Jason finally reached across the table, taking my trembling hand in his. We can't change what happened, but we can fix this together. He looked at Emma, who was resting quietly now, her tiny fingers curled into my shirt. She's ours, Lily, and I'm not letting either of you go again. For the first time in years, I believed him. And for the first time in months, I let myself hope, not just for Emma's health, but for something I thought I'd lost forever. A family. Emma's surgery was scheduled within the week. Jason insisted on overseeing every detail himself, staying by her side before and after the procedure. Watching him work, calm and focused, I saw not just the man I once loved, but the doctor he had become. The one who fixed hearts for a living, including mine. The morning of the surgery, I sat in the waiting room, clutching a cup of coffee I didn't drink, my fingers trembling. Jason came over, still in scrubs, and crouched beside me. She's going to be okay, Lily. I promise. I nodded, unable to speak. For hours, I sat there replaying every moment of Emma's life. The first time she smiled, her soft giggles, the way she held my face when she was tired. Losing her was unthinkable. When Jason finally emerged, pulling off his cap, his eyes were wet. She's fine. The surgery was a success. Relief hit me so hard I covered my face and sobbed. Jason pulled me into his arms, holding me until the trembling stopped. You don't have to do this alone anymore, he whispered. The days that followed felt like stepping into sunlight after years of gray. Jason moved us into his home, temporarily while Emma recovered. At first, it felt strange. His world was polished, stable, so different from my tiny apartment above the sewing shop. But Jason didn't treat me like a guest. He treated me like family. Grandma Ruth visited with soup and flowers, hugging Emma like she was her own great-grandchild. One afternoon, while Emma napped, Jason and I sat on the porch swing where everything had once started. Lily, he said softly, I know we've lost a lot of time, and I know I can't erase what happened, but I love you. I always have. Will you give me another chance? The answer came without hesitation. Yes, Jason. I want that too. We married 6 months later in a small ceremony by the Savannah River. It wasn't grand, but it was perfect. Emma scattering flower petals with a huge grin, Grandma Ruth crying happy tears, and even Jason's father showing up, looking quietly proud. His mother chose not to attend, and for the first time, it didn't matter. Our new home wasn't a mansion like his parents' estate, but it was ours, a warm, light-filled house with a garden big enough for Emma to run through barefoot. I planted roses along the fence, their scent filling the air every morning. Jason built Emma a swing set, and every evening, He taught her how to pump her legs higher, laughing alongside her. Sometimes I'd sit on the porch and watch them, my heart so full it almost hurt. I thought back to that scared girl running barefoot in the rain, believing no one in the world cared if she disappeared. She was gone now, replaced by someone stronger, someone who had built a life full of love and belonging. We still face challenges. Life doesn't magically become perfect, but now we face them together. I had a husband who adored me, a daughter who was healthy and full of joy, and a home that finally felt like home. Looking out at the roses blooming under the Georgia sun, I whispered to myself, "This is what healing looks like." And for the first time in years, I believed it with all my heart.